At one point or another, we've probably all heard the phrase, freedom is not free. And usually this phrase is in the context of the sacrifices that American citizens have made in our armed forces when defending our countries from time of attack and also in war or terrorist attack. However, that phrase is also applicable to some of the historical conflicts that we have had as Americans within our own borders. As Americans, freedom is one of our most cherished values. We celebrate it with civic holidays like the 4th of July, which celebrates freedom from British rule. Also Labor Day, which celebrates freedom from labor exploitation. And we commemorate it with holidays like Memorial Day and Veterans Day. And yet there are times in our increasingly networked but relationally disconnected society that freedom gets a little twisted. Freedom sometimes is something that we focus on only as individuals. We don't see the bigger picture of what freedom means to us in our community. And we forget that freedom is really both sides of the same coin of a healthy society: liberty and responsibility. It's both freedom from and freedom for. And when historians look at world history, they often describe American democracy as the American experiment. And what they mean by that is that the forming of the United States was really the first time in world history that democracy was launched as a startup with the means and mechanism of being scalable. That's the language of contemporary technology entrepreneurs. It was inherently grassroots, founded on the principle of a better life for all citizens. And that meant that everyone had to possess liberty in order to act responsibly so as to create this new civic society. You couldn't fully participate and be a citizen and contribute to this new society if you didn't have the freedom to do so. So this free society would itself create opportunities for the flourishing of all life and the pursuit of happiness. And one of the enduring cultural attributes of America is that we are builders and creators, innovators and problem solvers. We are inherently concerned with making a good society and with leaving behind an even better one for our children. Responsibility is part of our cultural DNA, and freedom is a necessary prerequisite for that. Responsibly has to be enacted widely, both geographically and socially, but it can't be unless freedom is also enacted widely, both geographically and socially. And yet, we also know that the story of the American experiment has also been one of a struggle to make that freedom more universally experienced by all Americans, and it has not been without conflict and cost, even a civil war. Yes, for Americans, freedom certainly has not been free. In our scripture reading for today, in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his followers that the Spirit of truth will come and guide them in all truth. The whole point of Jesus' activity on earth as God in the flesh is to reveal the truth of who God is and the nature of our relationship to God. And it's summed up by Jesus himself as the Spirit of truth. The energy and ethic of Jesus guides us individually in small actions and collectively in historically important moments, all to greater freedom, responsibility, interconnection, mutual care, and compassion, loving our neighbor as ourselves. As Paul also says in many places, the work of Christ frees us from slavery to sin so that we can be liberated to serve God and our neighbors. Again, freedom from and freedom for need to remain connected. In our American history, we can also witness the work of the Spirit of truth being our companion and proclaiming the way forward that God wants us to take, guiding us into a more perfect union if we have the strength and courage to listen and to follow. Today's movie is about the life and spiritual journey of one woman who had such strength and courage, and how the Spirit of truth showed her the way to lead hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. On this Peace with Justice Sunday, we visit the life and faith of Harriet Tubman, a young, married, enslaved worker in Maryland. We begin with her escape to Philadelphia and witness her deepening faith in God, providing her with the courage and strength to become the Moses of the Underground Railroad. Harriet's heroic life has much to say about the truths of injustice, racism, violence, and oppression. When we watch this movie, there's a central question we should try to ask ourselves. How is the Spirit of truth directing us to meet these issues today with faith and courage? So a little background about the film and the narrative. Minty, a young female slave on a Maryland plantation, has visions, flashes of the future. She can see the future, and she believes in her heart, in her faith, that these visions of the future are shown to her by God, and that there must be a purpose why she's seeing these. Her husband, John Tubman, a free man, secured a letter from a lawyer proving that Minty's mother was supposed to be freed in a will, and that therefore her children should be free as well. And so when they approach Mr. Broadus, the owner of the plantation, he's angry about the fact that this legal document may jeopardize his property and his running of the plantation. So he tears up the letter and cruelly denies the request. Minty cries and prays to God for Mr. Broadus to die. And then later that night, in his sleep, he does. His son, Gideon, who grew up with Minty, heard her praying this prayer. And Gideon is furious, because only Minty and Gideon know that she did this prayer. Minty feels guilty that somehow she asked God to kill him, and so she's responsible for the death. Gideon is angry at Minty because he's blaming her for his father's death, but at the same time, as a white man, he doesn't want to give her the power to think that God listens to her prayers. So he's conflicted, but he's furious. And so he decides he's going to sell Minty downriver, where she will never see her family or her husband again. She decides to flee to the north, and her husband John insists on going with her. But she knows that if they are caught, he will lose his freedom and become a slave as well. So in order to protect him, Minty leaves without telling John, managing only a silent goodbye to her mother, Rit, from a distance. She goes to her father, Ben, who directs her to the beginning of the Underground Railroad. In the scene we're about to watch, Minty is chased by Gideon and his hired hands and bloodhounds to a bridge where they trap her with men and dogs on either side. Gideon tries to convince her to return with false promises, even though he has already gouged out the left eye of her husband John when he found out that she ran away. Minty, having suffered unspeakable abuse her whole life at the hands of Gideon and his family, realizes there are only two options for her that are worthwhile anymore: freedom or death, and one may no longer be possible.
Whoa, whoa, easy now. Easy now. And I've decided not to sell you after all. The fact is, I'd miss you. Now, you've been there all my life. Like your mama was all my daddy's. Daddy vowed never to sell your mama. And I'm vowing never to sell you. You can come on back. I won't hurt you bad. You can stay at home, stay with John, stay with us. Would you like that?
I'm gonna be free or die.
The men believe she died, but Minty survives and travels all the way to the north on a very dangerous journey all by herself. Once she arrives, she meets with William Still of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, who helps to organize the Underground Railroad. He helps Minty get settled in her new life as a free woman, and in the next scene, asks her to pick out a new name. Harriet, her mother's name, and Tubman, her husband's last name. Names convey identity and the power of potential. They connect us to both our past and our future. By leaving her slave name, she also transcends the power of the plantation to tell her who she is.
So where are the others?
Well, no others.
You know, you can trust me. I'm a friend. Who'd you make the journey with?
I left my husband and family. It was just me and the Lord.
Well, I don't know if you know how extraordinary this is, but by some miraculous means, you have made it 100 miles to freedom, all by yourself. Would you like to pick a new name to mark your freedom? Most ex-slaves do. Any name you want.
They call my mama Rip, but her name Harriet. I want my mama name and my husband. Harriet Tubman.
1 year later, Harriet has sent word to her husband and family that she is still alive, but she has not heard anything back. She tells William that she needs to go back and get her husband, and he thinks she's crazy. She's already escaped and now has freedom to go back into Maryland and risk being recaptured and killed. He insists that it's too dangerous. In this next clip, she pushes back against his advice and reminds him that it was only the Lord that got her to freedom, and her faith in God will help her free more people from slavery, and that she has to go back.
Rescuing slaves requires skill and careful planning. It requires reading, Harriet. Can you read a sign or a map? Can you read it
I
all?
put my attention on trying to hear God's voice more clearly.
Do you know what would happen if you got caught? They would torture you until you pointed them right to this office. You got lucky, Harriet. And there's nothing more you can do.
Don't you tell me what I can't do. I made it this far on my own. God was watching, but my feet was my own. Running, bleeding, climbing, nearly drowned, nothing to eat for days and days, man. I made it. So don't you tell me what I can't do.
So I won't share too much more of this amazing film because you really need to see it for yourself. It got critical acclaim, and one of the great things about it is the casting is fantastic. The historical events are very accurate. If you have a chance, please join us this afternoon, 3 o'clock in the Fellowship Hall. We'll be showing it like we're doing with all of the films in this movie series. What I really, really admire about this film is how it achieves an adept balance of both the historical facts and the social realities of the cruelty and barbarism of American slavery, along with the powerful character development of Minty/Harriet herself. This movie is really about her and her own journey, not just journey from slavery to freedom, but journey in her own spiritual walk with God. In this film, she is not a two-dimensional social justice icon, but instead a flesh and blood human being who exemplifies what having the Spirit of truth at work in her and guiding her as a companion of the Father really looks like. We see her spiritual growth throughout the film unfold before us as she develops into the intense woman of God and courageous Underground Railroad conductor that we remember her as. In fact, she led more slaves to freedom than any other Underground Railroad conductor. And on June 2nd, 1863, under the command of Union Colonel James Montgomery, she became the first woman to lead a major military operation in the United States. Along with 150 African-American Union soldiers, she rescued more than 750 slaves in the Combahee Ferry raid during the Civil War. What we see in this film is a person whose faith is deepened through the trials and whose walk with God is an inspiration to us all. She is truly an example of what John Wesley would describe as moving on to perfection. Not that she didn't make mistakes, but that she was growing closer and closer to God through all of her work and all of her struggles. And so her life is also a model for us as a nation in our collective move to greater perfection, even though it may look like and it feels like at this moment in history we have stumbled a bit with all of the rancor and divisiveness and partisan vitriol that we have seen around us in the last decade or so. But I am encouraged too, because there are beacons of hope on our path as a society and as Americans. In addition to being Father's Day, today, as we mentioned, is also Juneteenth. Both an old and a new holiday that commemorates and celebrates freedom. The freedom that came with the end of slavery and with the defeat of the Confederacy at the end of the Civil War, announced on the 19th of June, 1865, in Galveston, Texas. It is a day for celebration and service, for introspection and learning more about the work that still needs to be done, the work of the Spirit of truth alive in our community, guiding and leading us all on to greater perfection. When I lived in Mississippi, when our family was there, I taught for 15 years at a small college called Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. Tougaloo College is what is known as one of the 105 HBCUs, stands for Historically Black College and University. These colleges were formed after the Civil War because even though former slaves were now free to go to college, many of the colleges and universities still would not admit them because they were of African descent. This particular college was founded in 1869, but its history is rather fascinating because the American Missionary Association, which was a group of Christians involved in the Underground Railroad in upstate New York, had been working in Mississippi to help free slaves. And when the Civil War ended, representatives of the AMA came down to Jackson, Mississippi, and they approached John Body, who had a plantation north of the city, about 450 acres. This was in 1865. And of course, John realized that he was now bankrupt because without slaves, there was no way that he could operate his plantation. So they made an offer to him to sell this plantation, and he accepted, although they did not tell him what they were going to do with the property. So over the next 4 years, they began to set it up as a college for newly freed slaves, and in 1869, it opened its doors for its first class of students. Those students, that entering class of 1869, graduated in 1881, 12 years later. Now, you may be asking, why did it take 12 years to graduate the first class? It was because slaves in the South, prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, were not allowed to read. And in fact, anyone who was caught teaching a slave to read was put to death. It was a capital crime, white or black, didn't matter. So most of these entering students couldn't read, and they probably had what would be equivalent today to maybe a first, maybe at best, second-grade education. So it's actually quite remarkable that in 12 years, they went from there to a full college education. And many of them then became the first several decades of graduates of Tougaloo College were teachers. It was a kind of a teacher's college first before it expanded. I taught there as an associate professor for 15 years in the field of religious studies and philosophy, and I got to know my students really, really well. One of the fascinating things about the physical architecture of the campus was that they still had the original plantation owner's building, the mansion, the family mansion, intact. And it had been renovated several times since the 1860s. And now it is where the president holds her office. It's also where the admissions department recruits new students. And so it sits in the center of campus on one side, connected by a sidewalk that goes from the porch and the front door of the mansion right to the main sanctuary doors of the chapel. So there's a really interesting spiritual axis of energy when you go onto this campus between a symbol of enslavement and a symbol of liberation, and this pathway that leads between them. And so every year at commencement, when we would celebrate our new graduates, we would circle around, the faculty would process with all of our flags of our departments and everything like that, and the president before us, and then the students behind us, and we would circle the interior of the campus several times. By the way, if you've ever been to a black worship service in the South, you know they usually last about 2 or 3 hours. Same thing with commencement services. We never usually did our commencement services in less than 4 hours, because this whole procession itself would take about 45 minutes with a lot of African hand drumming going on. It was a great experience. And then after several loops around, the faculty would line up on either side of the sidewalk, and then we would have our students pass through us and walk from the front porch, the front doors of the mansion, the symbol of slavery, right through us, on the sidewalk to the chapel. And this was the beginning of the rest of their lives, where they could experience symbolically the past generations of sacrifice that helped them to get where they were. as students, in their family, but all of the heroes that went before them who made sacrifices to move from oppression to freedom, and to know that this was done with God's help, with God's power. And they were not alone. They were part of a community that wanted them to be free, that wanted them to flourish, that wanted them to work in the spirit of truth. And we need to remember that for many African American communities today, the abolition of slavery was not the same thing as freedom. For these communities, freedom is still a hard-fought goal, not fully attained. A prominent African-American theologian, Guy Nave, put it this way: Juneteenth commemorates and celebrates a historic turning point that has sparked other historic turning points in the struggle of Black Americans for genuine freedom in this nation. Juneteenth is a day that all freedom-loving Americans should honor and celebrate because it represents the proclaimed ideal of freedom for all people. The Spirit of Truth tells us that we are created to be free. Free from oppression and free from slavery to others, to ourselves, and to sin. But most of all, created to be free for loving our neighbors as ourselves. Amen.